Sonia, Claudia, you want to get us started? Asha, Laura, Mary.
You want to share the questions?
Yeah, the questions.
So let me read the questions that we came together. We collectively came up with the questions. The questions that we had put together in our research group sort of had to do with sort of, the genealogies of post-colonial and de-colonial scholarship. But they tend to get pitched at each other as sort of one being from South Asia and the other one being from Latin America. And as an Asian who works in Latin America, I find that really complicated and problematic. So one of the questions we had in our research group was to sort of think about the multiple genealogies of these scholarship, and especially their relationship to anti-colonialism. We were also thinking about issues of migration and immigration and what they have to do with post-colonial and de-colonial scholarship. And there was one other question on research project that I'm missing that is come up. And what we have over here, the conversations that we had during our last reading group, we came up with these questions. How do post-colonialism and decolonialism help us think through our current political moment? How have these two approaches addressed or failed to address issues of Islam in the Middle East, and actually I would say North Africa and Africa? How can they inform our current discussions about immigration? What methods do post-colonialism and decolonialism offer for scholarship and activism during this time? How do they respond to the rise of the global right? So again, this is certainly not a full set of questions, but these were the questions that we were thinking about sort of, in late January when we met.
So Karen, can you start us with what you found in your group? Just some of the, so you must have, to come to these questions, you must have had insights.
So when we started speaking, a lot of our analysis was on where decolonialism, postcolonialism meet or don't meet. And in particular, we spent a lot of time talking about where they do not meet. And then this political moment happened. And it occurred to us that they are both ultimately politically engaged pedagogies and theoretical traditions, coming from places that have experienced a lot of what's going on right now in the rest of the world in the past. So I think our goal was to talk fairly concretely, even while locating ourselves in this theoretical corpus that is postcolonialism or decolonialism, to talk about what they can offer us right now. So, for instance, what would be a decolonial methodology for this moment in time, or a post-colonial one? That's sort of where I understood this coming from.
Yeah, I agree. And also what Christy was saying is that when we were having these conversations about how these two approaches don't meet, they were also exactly the places where there was potential for them to, there were these disjuncts that needn't be disjuncts. They kind of pitched as, not in, what struck me about the five college conversations is, again, the variety of issues that it opened up that were relevant to the moment. That doesn't mean that there weren't differences, but it wasn't regionally focused. But then a few months later at the NWSA, the conversation seemed to be very, very, very regionally focused, and also methodologically kind of split into binaries where post-colonialism was thought about as being about deconstruction, and decolonialism was thought about as being practical, pragmatic, and about solutions, which was sort of, again, not how I see them. But they have multiple genealogies. Neither of them is a singular ism or a singular method. So then, when we were having this, in our first reading group, we kind of read some of the folks who are cited often as as being belonging to one or the other. And we kind of traced whether they invoke each other. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But then again, are they, if we were to invoke them in this moment, how useful would it be? And again, for what purpose?
Spivak, Mohanty, Lugonis,
And
Alcoff.
I mean, we came up with a very concrete list just because we had 1 week or 2 weeks to do the readings. So it was, again, not a comprehensive list, but we were just thinking about who could we read that we wanted to read or return and read together. So I'm just putting forward the names that we actually read, not a complete list.
But I was invited, so I'll talk. So, and I'm going to stand up because it's a big room. I want to make sure So I thank you for the invitation, and I may be totally off, but I have been reading about post-coloniality and de-colonial, and I was reading Asadua. She was interviewed, many decades ago, in the context of post-coloniality and rhetoric studies or something or other, and she seemed to be talking to the interviewer kind of in the way I'm talking to you right now, not in a very academic way, in a way, but she said that a lot of the concepts that she had about post-coloniality, even though she didn't use the terms, are attempts to connect to pre-Columbian histories and value systems with the post-colonial 20th century. So that's very much the reading that I've been doing. I'm not part of this reading group. And it was just very interesting. She actually, if you know Sadua, she has a whole terminology. And so she explained how she did it. She said that she was thinking about her audience of Chicanas and Chicanas and what they were going through in that moment. And she said that she wanted to show continuity with their histories of progression. I tried to give a term. I tried to find a language for my ideas and my concepts that comes from the indigenous part of me rather than the European part of me, so kind of de-colonial. So I came up with Guatlique and La Facultad and La Frontera and La Planta. Concepts that mean, here's a little nugget of a system of knowledge that is different from the Euro-American. This is my hit on it, but it's also mestizo, mestiza, cognitive kind of perception. So there's this ideology, or this little nugget of knowledge is both indigenous and Western. And she goes on and on, but I just happened to be reading this when I got your invitation. And then as far as politics, so another reading that I was doing is I'm looking at some literature. I do literary studies, and there's this wonderful book that I'm working on called El Suli Skirts. It's a novel, and it draws a lot on Haitian and Dominican Afro diasporic spirituality, right? And one of the authors I've been looking at, Omiseki Natasha Tinsley, talked about the spirituality can be looked at as an epistemology, not just religion. And I learned something really interesting that some of you probably already know. I didn't know this, but the spiritual and epistemological system will do, and this she also has a history where it comes from, is literally revolutionary. The Haitian Revolution, the world's only successful slave revolution, in which the slave Africans emancipated themselves and went on to defeat Napoleon's army to form the world's first black republic in 1804, began during the Ruby ceremony. And I've seen other references to that, in which enslaved Africans called on the Lua to support them in their right. And where I'm coming from with this is maybe that was a political moment, a difficult one. So I'll leave it at that.
What I did in terms of provoking discussion is that I tried to write some thoughts about the questions, but not all the questions, because in this circle there are more people who are more, adequate and have more knowledge to respond to some of the questions. But I was thinking about question number one, and also inquiring a little bit about question number 4. Number 1 is about the post-colonialism and de-colonialism. Help us think through our current political moment. And question number 4 is question about methodology. So in my view, one key issue we need to emphasize is the geopolitics of knowledge, as you all know. As Stuart Hall once said, political moments reduce theoretical movements. So how to develop a critical knowledge that speak back to hegemonic epistemologies in which racialized and feminized peoples have always been marginalized and oppressed. I think that both post-colonial and de-colonial feminisms, in their different projects of intervention in the epistemic repertoire, can contribute significant ways to developing knowledges that question dominant representations of the other, a project that is very dear to post-colonial feminisms, questions the dichotomies between the human and the non-human, as well as between culture and nature, a project also dear to the colonial feminism. And as a corollary of the above two questions, these critical knowledges will have to dismantle the lettered city and the liberal university towards the development of other possible and more inclusive lettered and unlettered cities, where we are able to unlearn modernity coloniality. I have an example that I wrote some thoughts that I have been researching about, is the example of climate change, or what people are saying that we are entering a new era. The era is called the Anthropocene. So I have been reading a lot about de-colonial feminisms, other cosmologies, and the Anthropocene, as well as material feminisms. So I'm trying to do like the Anthropocene asks us to do a whole new set of thinking processes that in a very famous article, Chakrabarty called The Time, I think it's a time of history, something like that, when it's at the Anthropocene or climate change. The Anthropocene is that it's a new era when human beings, humanity has become not only biological force, but a geological force, changing the whole nature of our planet. So this new era, the Anthropocene, forces us into thinking about how to put together human history and natural history. To juxtapose these two very different chronologies. So what Chakrabarty asks us is to develop a new thinking that he calls species thinking. Let us look as interspecies or multi-species, as Donna Haraway would say. I mean, our partial connection to other species and to the environment. So this requires us new tools to understand how we live in this world in partial connection with other species. So I've been reading a lot of material feminism and this new return, this return of the materiality into social theory. And in doing that, I've also been reading how the colonial feminism have also been talking about these multiple partial connections that we have to articulate between the human and non-human, minerals, organic and inorganic, when I talk about the non-human. And then, having these readings and the readings about the colonial feminism, I also am looking into what American perspectivism calls that there are not several perspectives on one universal world, but we have multiple worlds and multiple perspectives, multiple realities. What I'm trying to do in terms of methodology is very much what Haraway and Karen Barra talk about, diffractive reading. How instead of seeing the colonial feminism fighting against Western feminism, because that has a lot of the colonial feminism has been an attempt to delink from Western feminism. How can we read the colonial feminism diffractly through material feminism and trying to find partial connections between For instance, thinkers like Canberra, Donna Haraway, Susan Ackman, Stacey Alango, and the colonial feminists by doing this diffractive reading, and also going back to other cosmologies that American perspectivism, works with, and how to read other cosmologies diffractively through material feminism and the colonial feminism. So this would be a methodology that would help us instead of, fighting with one another, because a lot of the colonial feminists have been very much busy fighting with what they call Western hegemonic feminism. Instead of doing that, why not try, instead of trying, build solidarity or coalitions, I would say partial connections, and try to negotiate our difference through the practice of translation that in American perspectivism they call it equivocal translations. That means, what does mean equivocal translation? It means admit to the existence of incommensurate worlds while affirming the possibility of partial connections between them through a continuous negotiation of their respective divergences. So this is how I thought about this question. So theory and methodology.
So I'm Jennifer Hamilton again from Hampshire College, and I should out myself as a psychologist, I think, right off the bat. In part because the sort of question of the de-colonial and the post-colonial is both a really significant issue and is not, right, depending on where one is looking at the discipline. And I think in part because of, sort of the other is that to sort of find a discipline more rooted in the colonial is really sort of difficult. And so these are ongoing questions in my own work and in terms of how I approach these different genealogies of de-colonial and post-colonial, and I'm trying to sort of figure out exactly where I'm going to focus in, and I'll do the thing of talking about my own work. But so part of my training as an anthropologist was sort of law and indigenous peoples, in particular working on the Northwest Coast. Something I found very difficult, in part because it was this deeply fraught political context. And again, as a white Canadian woman sort of circulating in that area, really became kind of a key part of my research was how I was circulating was actually more important oftentimes. And so then part of the kind of scavenger sort of mentality in anthropology is that you sort of take whatever methodological and analytical tools are available to you to help you make of things. Something that really seems to tick off literary scholars and historians. Because oftentimes I think that the sort of concern is that there's a lack of depth in terms of understanding these things. And at the same time, I started off there, I finished my dissertation, I finished that project, and for a variety of reasons it became really clear to me that I wasn't going to go back and work in that particular location. And I needed health insurance, and so I was offered a postdoctoral position, which a friend of mine told me about, and she said, it'll be good for you, it's about Indians. So I was like, cool, genetics and Indians, I can do that. Well, it turns out, in fact, that the project that I was invited to apply for a job was actually about South Asians with draftees in Houston in particular, and related to the collection of blood samples for a transnational or international genomics project. And of course, the centrality of indigeneity, right, in its sort of more American sense in genomics is probably familiar to a lot of folks. And so I took that job, I got my health insurance, that was awesome. And it appeared at first as though these two projects had nothing to do with each other. And to fast forward, I'm going to argue, in fact, that they do. And in part, they have to do with the sort of proliferation of discourses of difference in powerful institutions and how they act. I think that's actually a key area of investigation for this political moment. The other thing that it did was that, in fact, the sort of Columbus-inspired mistake, right, that I thought that the project I was going to be working on was indigenous folks as opposed to South Asians, is actually a really important moment and has become significant in our work moving forward, and some of the work that I've done collaboratively with folks in this room. And so, thinking about these distinct figures of the Indian over here and the Indian over there that sort of embody this, as figures embody this sort of distinction or tension between the decolonial and the post-colonial. Part of what started to happen is as I moved forward in the project around specifically Gujaratis and this diaspora community living in Houston, whether or not they were going to participate in this larger genomics project, and whether or not there would be ethical concerns. Well, it turns out, in fact, there weren't any that were registered anyway in terms of the ethnographic work we did in the project. And so this became really an interesting moment for me to think about as sort of, again, the distinction between the figures of the Indian and Indian in terms of how we approach these things and how these different histories have developed. And so more recently, I'm working on a book project called The Indian in the Freezer, which is really about indigeneity and genomics and how genomics researchers have a particular imaginary of indigeneity and how this gets reinvented through genomic research. And of course, what started to happen is that my sort of original sites and locations have been sort of, in sort of traditional analytical frame. I've had to move to different places, and one of the places, oddly, that I've ended up in is Puerto Rico, which I never expected. And so part of the relationship that I'm trying to draw out is that the relationship between indigenous communities and diasporic communities in the United States, for example, when we look at how different scientific projects are unfolding, especially around genomics and difference, is that certain communities are identified as genomics-friendly communities, certain communities have been identified as not particularly friendly or sympathetic to these causes. And then the question for me is, how is the same research, genomics research, that sort of perpetuates a kind of colonial mentality about indigeneity, about South Asians, about the role of biological difference in powerful institutions, and then how does this work together? And so one of the things that I found and how I ended up sort of locating another dimension of this research in Puerto Rico is that in the project I was working on, which was called the International Haplotype Map, or the HAP Map, we did not approach any indigenous groups in the United States for participation in this research because it was considered to be unethical. So this is in the mid-2000s. We did, however, and in the subsequent project, the 1,000 Genomes Project, approach so-called mixed race peoples, so Mexican Americans in Los Angeles, and then more recently Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. The Puerto Rican samples that were collected have now been used for a project used to reanimate indigenous genomes, which effectively bypasses the sort of ethical concerns that made it inappropriate to approach indigenous peoples in the first place. And so part of why I wanted to lay this out is I think it actually demonstrates how, in fact, a kind of rigid distinction between post-colonial and decolonial thought, both in terms of location and also in terms of what they can do theoretically and methodologically for us, is not something I'm invested in. And so again, how then do we draw what on its surface appears to be a profound lack of connection? And in fact argue that the various sites where we have diaspora communities like Houston actually have rich indigenous histories, and how it is that it becomes a center of medical research actually has a lot to do with this possession of land. Right? And so how do we make those kinds of connections across these spheres, thinking about both the decolonial and the post-colonial? Just to end, I want to make the pitch that I wake up sometimes and I'm like, really, am I doing the most important work that I could be doing? Is this really what I should be doing? Precisely because of the political moment in which we now find ourselves in the various political moments leading up to that. And I think that one of the things that this kind of work can do is both draw attention to the sort of historical processes of what we call elsewhere racial and sexual formation, right? The sort of Not that those are just intersectional identities, but they constitute each other. Right? And then can we use these tools to sort of approach some of the things that are unfolding, both in terms of their larger historical context, but also what's new, right? And how can we have a language to encounter some of the things that appear, really on a daily basis, right? In terms of how do we think about diasporic communities, indigeneity, and Islamic folks, right? I actually think there's something really important going on there. And so for me, this has been kind of my journey through the decolonial and the postcolonial. And so
my name is Lisa Armstrong and I'm Hamilton Smith. In thinking, the conversation that we had at the Black Policy Research Center got me thinking about the moment that I've been doing some work around in 1945, 1942, 43, 44, 45, at a time that was considered part of, right on the cusp of post-colonial, right on the cusp of post-colonial nation formation. And the emergence of strategies, and I'm interested in the theoretical, that piece that you took from Karen Barad, the partial connections between incommensurate worlds. And I think the solidarities that I saw emerging from this period, I thought I would lay out some of them here. It's from a conference that was held in 1945, and then walk backwards from there. And it was a conference of left-wing women's organizations that were invited to Paris by a group called the Women's International Democratic Federation. It was a group that was starting then, and it was starting it came out of these anti-fascist women's organizations around the world. And the fight on the floor was immediate in Paris, because the assumption in Paris was that the women who were on the front lines of German fascism were in fact the truly political women in the room. And yet they'd invited women from Ivory Coast, from Ghana, from Algeria, from Morocco, from India. So there was this huge group of women there who were suddenly being faced with an assumption by the opening plenaries that they had been on the back foot. They weren't on the front lines of the struggle against fascism. And immediately at this conference, another form of solidarity started to emerge to push back on that idea that they had missed the real struggle, and the assumption that fascism had been won, right? So this is after the formal end of World War II. So this invitation happens, and the debate hits the floor immediately after these opening plenaries. And a number of delegates, some from the ones that were most active in this fight were from Algeria, from Morocco, from India, and I think those were the three most active participants in this debate. And it got me thinking about what are forms of complicity, solidarities of complicity and solidarities of commonality. So we think of solidarity as something to say, I hear what's happening, let me stand up and stand alongside you, right? Let me stand as an actor who seeks to support the work you're doing. What I saw emerging in this fight in 1945 in Paris was something that I started to call solidarity of complicity. So rather than saying, I hear your struggle, let me stand next to you in a kind of likeness, a similarity, this emergence of relationships to power. So first of all, the fight was that fascism wasn't done, that in a moment when colonialism was seeking to, in fact, retain its grip and harden its grip after the end of World War II, and in the practices that were deeply colonial practices that supported the European fronts at the expense of the North African, West African, and South Asian fronts, right? So we're seeing mass starvation in these locations because of the shift of food to the European battlefronts. And the second was that women around the world had not missed the fight against fascism because they weren't in European countries. So these two arguments were laid out immediately. And what started to emerge, and this is what I found after reading the transcripts of this conference, I kept thinking, surely this didn't emerge in 1945. Surely this theory of solidarity was emerging in the global south before this moment, because it was so well coordinated. The response was so thoughtful and careful and well articulated. And as I started looking through the record, I realized that this other solidarity of complicity, was starting to emerge. And here's where I think the debate in post-colonialism, what I'd like to do is separate out two things which I think get conflated. One is post-colonialism as the formation of a post-colonial nation state. The other is invocation and adherence to nationalism, right? And I'd just like to put a little air between these two things. So, and think about what this theory of complicity meant. And I think I'd like to think about what a theory of complicity means now. So in 1945 at this Congress, there were a number of, let's see if I can pull out some of the quotations. So J. Kishore Hindu, who was coming from the Indian independence movement, from a nationalist movement, was there, and she talked about the campaign in India to fight against using Indian troops in the Dutch colonial efforts to quash the Indonesian independence movement. Am I articulating this so that it makes sense? Okay. So what Hindu invoked at this meeting, she said, at present, India is extremely upset by the events unfolding against the Indonesian people. You can imagine their outrage and shame when they discover the use of their own troops to repress the legitimate desire of a people to be free, while they themselves are fighting for their independence. So what started to emerge in the 1940s, around about 42, 43, was this solidarity of complicity where Indian women were organizing to make sure that Indian troops were not being mobilized in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Malaya to repress independence movements. The movement, though, rather than as in part commonality, you can hear she's saying the horror. Here we are fighting for our independence, and Indian troops are being used to quash other independence movements, right? There's a solidarity of commonality. This is the one we tend to think of alongside solidarity. There's also one that emerged of a solidarity of complicity. She said, in fact, it is our duty as Indian women to push against the use of Indian troops in Indonesia. Now, under British rule, one could argue, as a colonial state, this is not your complicity, right? This is not a decision made by an Indian national government. What they argued, however, in these campaigns, as I've started pulling them out of this period in the mid-40s, was that it was precisely their complicity, even under a colonial government where they were not making the decision to put their troops. So one of the articulations that was emerging is a nation state as if it existed. And that the fight was as if they were citizens, as if their government were making the choice to bring Indian troops to support the Indonesian, the Dutch colonial forces in Indonesia. And here's the tricky part of solidarity of complicity. What does it mean to stand in a location that has the critique of its own place, even as it's aspiring to another state? So I don't want to take up too much time, but so this idea, the relationship between nationalism and the adherence or the support for the formation of an independent nation state gets more complex after 1947 in India. And one of the struggles, so these struggles continue. The same women who came to the conferences, who started organizing these fights in 1942 and 1943 within the nationalist movement, within the mainstream nationalist movement. In 1945, they brought these debates to, and formed a kind of global South coalition at the meetings in Paris. By 1947, when India had independence, these struggles were continuing under the Nehru government. And what was emerging in parts of what is now Andhra Pradesh in the Telangana struggle, which was a peasant struggle led by peasant women as well as peasant men, up in West Bengal, in Maharashtra, there were these struggles that were either Adivasi, they were indigenous people struggles, or Dalit people struggles, or peasant people struggles, right? So the very people least represented either in the colonial state or in the new nationalist state started to build alternate societies. So there's alternate governance systems. So in the case of Bengal, which is now part of Bangladesh, but it was right on the border, this is a difficult border moment. These communities were forming in an area named Dinajpur, up along the border of the northern border of West Bengal, what is now West Bengal, that had an argument that was both against the nation state, demanding of independence, a solidarity that crossed borders, was both decolonial and post-colonial. And the argument there in Telangana, as well as in Maharashtra, as well as in Bengal, is that we need a leadership based on the people. Right? And it was not articulated through decolonialism, and it was threading the language of postcolonialism. But I think these questions of complicity, a solidarity of complicity, allow for the kind of traveling after the formation of the nation state to demand more radical ends, more radical leadership. And I'm not sure what the place today would be of these theories and these ideas and these social movements, because that's really where these slogans came from. But I think it's something we have to consider. What are solidarities and complicity that are essential? And what are the movements that we should be building that allow for the mass base for those
So I'm kind of thinking it's going to take us in a slightly different direction, in the sense that when I started thinking about this question, I started thinking about pedagogy and actually a little bit institutionally, because so last semester I was teaching a course on post-colonial, I should say I'm in an English department, post-colonialist, and also American Studies person. That's what became clear in the story that I'm about to tell. But so I was teaching a course on the post-colonial novel and the nation, an undergraduate course. And the reason I started thinking about this course when I looked at the questions was that actually so in the middle, well, towards the end of the semester, right, the election happens. And one of the things that helped a tiny bit was actually a conversation I had with my students. And so say a little bit more about this course. It's community writing course, Postcolonial novel of the nation, but I start with My Antonia, so Willa Cather's novel, and I end with Whirling the R. So I don't know if people are familiar with that, with either of those novels actually, but so we Willa Cather's kind of evacuation and the romanticization of the colonization of the West, right? And then we end with Rolling the R's, which is a book by Arzamora Lindmark that's looking at queer Filipino youth in Hawaii in the 1970s, right? So it's kind of like bookended. And then in between there, I had several novels by South Asian writers and by African writers, but I really very deliberately bookended it with these two different and yet different and continuous movements of U.S. imperialism. Okay, so that was the framework for the class. But again, the election happens, and so we just sort of took the class to talk about it. And the thing that struck me, I'm not going to go into detail about the conversation, but it struck me that I did feel like, okay, just getting towards the end of the semester, that students really did have a vocabulary to think about articulations of U.S. and of global systems of power and oppression, and I felt like had this perspective, which I will not take credit for, rather. So that was just sort of a moment, but it also brought me to a couple of things, and this is where I kind of sort of to institutional. Maybe I should look at my notes because I have more points. This is going to be a long day. And I also wanted to maybe just say, backing up a second, so I'm really new to this conversation about post-colonial and de-colonial. I very much was trained as a post-colonialist, and I do South Asia and I do the U.S., but I also sometimes, something I balk at, I'm not saying this happens necessarily in the decolonial, post-colonial conversation, is that post-colonial studies get sort of branded as just sort of post-structuralist, and it's kind of like the deconstructive, right? Which I think those are very, very important, but I also myself trace more with
I had a meeting with
which also is all into this course, but so one of the things that this made me think about this conversation is kind of like maybe the work that was hopefully the work that was happening in the classroom that was prepping students to think about this moment is another trend that has been happening. And again, this is kind of a literary studies question, an institutional one, which is the replacement of postcolonial. Heard my rant on postcolonial global anglophone. So what I actually asked a graduate student in my department is postcolonialists on the job market. What do the jobs look like? How are they being described? And whereas when I went on the job market 10 years ago, most of the jobs I applied for were explicitly post-colonial. Now it's really there's world literature, there's a global anglophone. Seems to be the way that these jobs are being described. And I find it really disturbing because I think about the political work that's happening in the classroom that kind of comes out of a training in colonial studies, and I hope that most people who are applying for those global anglophone jobs still have that training. But nonetheless, why are we taking, to me there is something very explicitly political about the post-colonial that is really evacuated when you're just sort of writing in English from all over the world. And I think that's a very dangerous, it's a very dangerous trend, and I think it also speaks to this sense that as post-colonial approaches got taken up by different fields, so by American studies certainly, or just like these transnational terms more generally, as this kind of methodology was taken up in other places, it's as if the post-colonial begins to disappear. Like, we don't need it anymore. Of course, this argument was made with feminism, right? We don't need, everyone will be doing feminism, so we won't need, women, gender, and sexuality studies departments, which is, obviously a very dangerous argument, and I do feel that a similar thing might be happening within English departments with post-colonial, and I think it's really important because, not only, right, do we need faculty lines, and do we need people doing this kind of work and teaching, in fact, teaching literature in English from the rest of the world, but I would hope doing it with, the methodology and the politics of post-colonial studies. So, there's maybe a little more in my rant.
So in these conversations we've been having, I'm also very compelled by that it's unfortunate that there are these, sort of camps or particular histories and genealogies, but they're very real. If you go into post-colonial studies, it references a particular set of authors. If you read De-coloniality, it references another set, and hopefully through these conversations we'll learn to read across these. But I think one of the biggest insights for me about post-colonial studies is really questioning the post, and in recognizing how much of coloniality and the colonial legacy lives on in these so-called independent post-colonial states like India. And so so for example, a moment like the Anthropocene, right, this term that has been, that is all in vogue, where suddenly now everyone wants to claim this is human-created climate change. And I think there's a lot of pushback saying, which humans really created most of this stuff? So there's the politics behind that terms like the Anthropocene erase. And so, like, nation states like India have really pushed back, on this question, and that some countries developed by creating all this mess, but now we should all suffer equally to erase that mess. And sort of really talking about the politics of the environment, if you keep coloniality in center, and to some extent Anthropocene is a re-emergence of a particular kind of colonialism in looking for solutions. But in thinking about India and talking about the global right, we have the global right in India. And it is this sort of ironic time, I would argue, in Indian history where the current Indian government is clearly anti-colonial, right? It's making arguments like this in the world stage. But part of what they're arguing is that when the partition happened, Pakistan became the Islamic Republic, but India remained a secular, multi-religious democracy. And in fact, India should be a Hindu nation. Right? And religious minorities should be religious minorities. And part of what the Hindu right, which finally came to power in 2015, so now they are the party in power. And all of this is very reminiscent of what is beginning to happen in this country, right? Of saying that this is a country of Hindus. And and what they're doing very powerfully is rewriting a Hindu past for India. That there was a great Vedic civilization in the past. Western science is part of that repertoire. So for them, modernity, globalization, ancient, all come together very, very seamlessly. And what I call an archaic modernity, right? So they want to be a global Hindu superpower. They want a place at the table. But at the same time, when you look at the ways in which they conceptualize gender or they conceptualize past, these are the places where the more regressive ideas, what women should do, how we should think about difference, in the country. So both those things sit together. So partly what seems to be happening in India is, so they are decidedly anti-colonial, but clearly not post-colonial in sort of their arguments of what's going on. And anything, and so I am really, I feel our vocabulary is very important for this moment in terms of the complexities by which the past and the present are coming together. And if anything, it seems like what the Hindu right is doing is recolonizing in some ways. Because they very much use a lot of, for example, British era laws, so the anti-sodomy laws, which the Hindu right has gone along with because there is no homosexuality amongst Indians, right? Or for the purity of women, the kind of policing that's happening on the streets of India today. So the ways in which gender and sexuality are being policed, openly. We now have to stand up when the national anthem is. The national anthem has to be played before every movie, and everyone has to stand up for the national anthem. So there are lots of very clear rules that are being enacted that seem to harken back to more the colonial era than any of the critiques that post-colonial or post-colonial thought has been raising. So I think, and similarly, of what is happening in this country, I really feel we need to develop new languages and a new vocabulary to capture what's going on.
So I'm not sure. My name is Ellen Correa. My discipline is communication. And thank you for inviting me. I wasn't quite sure how I would fit into this conversation. I'm still not, but really happy to be here and see. Right? So my research is very micro and within the macro. And maybe that'll really be clear when I say that the question that's been rolling around in my head since the election is, what if you love someone who voted for Trump? And so that's micro, right? And my research was about methodology that I used was a dialogic ethnography with my own family, second and third generation Puerto Rican, assimilated into U.S. white culture, some progressives, some conservatives. I mean, that's the thing about loving somebody who voted for Trump. And my research happened before the election, so. But it was getting together with my family to look at what does it mean that we have assimilated into U.S. white norms, that English is our first language, that we have lost much of our culture, that we don't really know what it means to be Puerto Rican or Puerto Rican descent. And part of that was also investigating that and learning about our own genealogy and trying to, for me, trying to recreate my own heritage. And talking with my two adult brothers and my mother, who were the co-participants, co-researchers in my study, about who we are and what does it mean? What does how we were brought up mean? Why were the decisions made by my grandparents and my parents that led to who we are right at this moment? So I don't have an answer to my question. What if you love somebody who voted for Trump? And thinking about methodologies, and thinking about how I couldn't invoke this methodology with the people in my family who voted for Trump. I just couldn't. And yet, wanting to and still hoping to, right, step back and be both the sister and the daughter and the researcher, which I was during this study. I don't know how this is to people, but this is what I'm thinking about now. This dialogic ethnography, where we were a family looking and talking and questioning things that we'd never questioned before. This is just who we are, and coming up with and learning about U.S. imperialism and about Puerto Rico and about who our ancestors were, and what they were doing and what they were living, and politically who they were at different points in Puerto Rico's history. I'm not sure what more I want to say about that. I was, maybe I'm the last one, I'm not sure, but maybe we can, I would love to talk with folks, because, when I wrote down divergent worlds and incommensurate worlds, and I thought, they're within my own family. And, obviously there's way more that needs to be done than what I'm thinking about here, but I think this is an important thing, at least for me at this moment in my life.
I wanted to add another, piggybacking off of Ellen, another example from Latino studies as a discipline, and kind of thinking through the Latino genealogies that we've seen leading up to this moment. My work is in Cuba and Cuban American communities, and I'm thinking about the turn of the 20th century in Cuba. And this is a moment when Cuba gets independence after the Spanish-American War in 1898, but is soon becomes a U.S. imperial subject. So there's U.S. control over Cuba in certain economic and cultural ways. So there's this moment that happens in the 1910s and 20s in Cuba where feminists see an opening because things are going so badly, because everyone is so upset that there are governments that are changing every year, 10 governments in a 10-year span, because the U.S. is so hated. And the way that feminists insert themselves in the politics of this moment is through nationalism. And that's what I want to talk about, is the role of nationalism in Latino social movements and Latin American social movements, and how useful and dangerous that has been, and where we are in this moment, and how we can avoid falling into some of those traps. So in the case of Cuba, the feminists are aware that the Cuban people want a nation. They want a concrete nation. They want to stand for something. They want an anthem. They want a flag. And they want to stand up against the U.S. And these are largely socialist feminists. So these are feminists whose politics are leftist and concerned, though they are mostly white and upper class, as was common in Latin America in this time period. They're nonetheless at least concerned with issues of class and to some extent issues of race. But what ends up happening is that they're so invested in building the nation that they fall into a sort of colorblind rhetoric, where issues of race are completely looked over. And in that way, they're complicit with the actual Cuban states of that moment that pass laws saying that to organize on the basis of race is illegal. So organizing on the basis of race is illegal, which means that organizing on the basis of racialized groups also becomes illegal. Slavery has just ended within a generation. So organizing, for example, as ex-slaves becomes illegal. So the feminists, in some ways, who are the most progressive voice, I think, in Cuba at this moment, are actually complicit with this colorblind rhetoric and complicit with this nation building. If we fast forward a little bit to the Cuban Revolution, we have these same socialist feminists supporting, of course, the socialist Cuban Revolution. And then with the advent of the Cuban Revolution, we have a new type of nationalism entering into Cuba, a very masculinist nationalism that is arguing for a sort of nation state that is beyond gender, beyond race, beyond class inequality, on the basis of a socialist nationalism. And while many of these things do occur more than they had occurred prior to 1959, there's nonetheless a way in which talking about race gets not made literally illegal, but gets made very difficult in Cuba between about 1959 and the 1990s. Because the idea is that you have to talk about the communist state, right? You're communist first, socialist first, depending on what time period, and black later. Or you're Afro-Cuban, but you're not black, right? Afro-Cuban in culture, but not black as a racial identity. So the feminists go along with it, because everybody goes along with it. Or else you go into exile, or else you get silenced in some kind of way. And the queers go along with it, and we see queer nationalism, and we see feminist nationalism between about 1960 and about the 1990s in Cuba. So if we put this in the context of today, we can see the same kind of development in other Latin American Latino countries. We can think about Puerto Rican nationalism, certainly. Also, in some instances, coming from a leftist critique, but ultimately resting upon the idea of a Puerto Rican nation as a way to resist against the American nation. We can think of the Chicano critique of U.S. imperialism that results in the concept of Aslan, the idea of the Chicano homeland that is itself, though not a nation state, a nation. And of course, this is problematized later by Sri Moraga. Aslan is queered and feminized and all of these things, but nonetheless, at its core is the idea of nationhood. So I'm looking now at where we are, and I'm looking at Latino studies as the field purports, and I purport, I think we all purport to be post-national. We have a great deal of books with that in the title. Our methodologies are diasporic and transnational, and if we look, as Asha was saying, if we look at the job postings, those are the keywords, are the ones that move beyond nation, diasporic, transnational, world literature, global Anglophone, which Latino then becomes a global Anglophone, right? Because it's mostly written in English. So in some ways it's global Anglophone, it's sort of a strange term. And yet, the organizing actually continues to maintain a nationalist framework. And that's the sort of, that gap is what concerns me so much about our political moment for Latinos organizing in the United States, is the fact that scholars have purported to move beyond nationalism, and yet we know how many Latinos voted for Trump and engaged in a sort of American nationalism. We know how many Latinos are engaging in organizing that is based on national origin. And the models that are existing that are sort of beyond national origin are, in my view, very commercial models. The Cosmo and Español model of Latinidad, right? Hey, chicas, how are you going to please your hombre, right? Or something. This is the kind of model that we get in commercial texts that seek to argue for a pan-Latinidad that's beyond conflict within the Latino community, but which is essentially depoliticized. So it's not, in many ways, a useful model. So the one movement that I have really has inspired me and that I've seen move beyond this, and I'm sure there are many more, but I think it sort of stands apart, is the undocu-queer movement. The undocu-queer movement, undocumented queer youths mostly, is largely a Chicano movement because it has originated in the Southwest, and because the largest population being targeted for their undocumented status is Mexican and Mexican American. So in some ways it is within a nationalist framework. But the way that the rhetoric is deployed is actually not nationalist, and I find that incredibly liberatory. And there's also not a queer nationalism in it. And we have to be very careful with queer nationalism, certainly in the case of Cuba and other nations as well, because they exist and they're very alluring to queer people that have been otherwise left out of the nation. And I think the undocu-queer movement, in my view anyway, manages to avoid falling into that trap. So this is sort of where I'm drawing hope from this day, is that movement, and hoping that
One big prerogative sitting over here to say a couple of things that occurred to me. A couple of weeks ago when we were asking these questions and I was thinking about the question of the first and de-colonial, and maybe a couple of weeks ago we started this thing of saying my work is wherever my work is. But my work is here in the United States and has been for the longest time, and here's how I know. That for me, the post and the de-colonial are drawing attention to the colonial moment, not as something that's over, but the work that it does, right? And the work that it's does, and continue to do, is that it puts the West and the United States in the center. And this conversation and the kind of things that are coming up, to me, the connection they make to the relevance of this work to the present moment in the United States is to decenter the United States, right? The kind of things that are happening in this country and have happened in this country for a long time. This is not at some level a new moment. It's a particularly intense moment, but it's certainly not a new moment, right? It's been around, I mean, all this stuff has been around, always. Every time you listen to NPR, it drives me crazy because there's this assumption that democracy is needed somewhere else, that nepotism happens somewhere else, that racism happens somewhere else, that women need to be saved somewhere else, right? Because it's always, this is the place and elsewhere needs help. So this conversation sort of helps me recall my pedagogical and political work in this country, which is to say, it's sort of the US and the West needs to learn from other places. Social movements in other places, the kind of things that Lisa was talking about, the kind of things that you're bringing up, right? It's like, what happened? What were these moments that led us to be who we are right now? So all I wanted to say is that, sometimes when we use these big words of isms and talk about our work, it seems like, well, how is this going to help us right now? It helps us, I think, by thinking about the fact that what's happening here can learn a lot from other places, and that's the gaze, that the nationalism at this moment, which is focusing on, oh my God, this is what's going on here, well, it's been going on for a long time. And the implications of continuing colonialism right now has implications for other places. So what can we learn from feminists elsewhere? What can we learn from Cuban feminists, from Indian feminists, from indigenous feminists, from Latino feminists? Okay, so that was some of the things that were occurring to me. All right, moderator, yours.
Questions, comments?
Hi, I'm Aurora. I